back to the GSP YouTube channel, guys. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to go ahead and do the old cliche thing, like, subscribe, ring the bell, tell your friends, comment, do all those things that all of us want you to do all the time. It helps us out. Appreciate you doing that. Today is going to be one that is kind of a popular vote as well. Most of these are. And I'm going to just use the same tune that I have on my Corvette, and we're going to make a nitrous tune out of it. I'm going to show you how easy it is to set up, in this case, dry nitrous. I'll also show you how to set up wet as well. But I think that I want to drive the point home that the Terminator X system is extremely well suited to handle dry nitrous, and I would really recommend all of you give it a fair shake. This is not the dry nitrous with your OE computers. This is dry nitrous with a computer that knows exactly what you're doing and knows how to handle that situation. So the first things first, you really need to start with a good NA tune. That's probably the most important thing that you can do here to not shoot yourself in the foot, is start with a good, well ironed out NA tune. Obviously the wide open throttle region is what we care about, but knowing your timing, knowing with a timing light, verifying your static timing, and also making sure that the wide open throttle region of your tune is correctly fueled is going to be extremely important with how you're going to set this up. So first things first, you've got yourself a nice NA tune, you're ready to go, and we're going to add nitrous to it. So you go up to the toolbox, and we're going to hit add in visual config. We're going to go down and we're going to find the nitrous. Double click that, default nitrous, bam, we have our little NOS bottle that pops up. Got a Nitrous ICF. So click on that one time and it'll bring you to here. So some of this is pretty straightforward. Some of it I'm going to give you some initial settings, and as fearful as I am to always give you guys initial settings, I think we're going to be okay here. I can give you some stuff to go off of that's going to be fairly safe. Like I said, in this case, we're going to do a dry progressive. I really love the progressive just because I've had the opportunity to play with that kind of stuff on the dyno, and I gotta tell you, the really cool thing about a progressive is even if you just command, let's say a 50% duty cycle on a 400 horse solenoid with 200 jets. And it's really important that you understand that whenever you're doing a progressive, you're doing a progressive of the solenoid and not of your jets. And the reason I say this is because I was very surprised one time, first time I did this, whenever I did a 50% pulse on a 400 horsepower solenoid, and I had 200 jets in the thing, and I was expecting to make an extra 100 horsepower because I was pulsing the solenoid 50%, which meant that I was going to get half of what I thought I was going to get, right? No. It's very important that you understand you're using the solenoid to pulse, not the jets. So, long story short, it still made 200 horsepower because half of 400 is 200. And I was very shocked when it did that. We got a good laugh out of it. No harm, no foul, because Mama Holley had my back and closed loop took the wheel and everything was fine. But it was definitely very surprising. That all said, the curve looked amazing. It looked like an NA power curve. It just happened to be with nitrous, and you didn't get that big spike in torque production that is so hard on drivetrain parts. So I'm a really big fan of the progressive stuff. All right, let's get back to it. Dry fuel delay in the fuel ramp literally is exactly what it sounds like. It just means that from the moment that we trigger, how long does it take for the nitrous to actually enter the engine? What I'm going to tell you is to start with until you can look at a data log and actually see how long it takes from the moment that you trigger it. And basically what this is for is to get a rich spike out. You can go back into your data log, observe, and see if you did have a rich spike. If you did, come in here and add some time to it. You can look in your data log and see how much time you need to add and do it right here. Very easy to do. This is really for the guys that have their solenoids that are mounted pretty far from the inlet of the engine. Me personally, I've really used this very little at all. This is a good one right here I want to cover before we get into the meat and potatoes. Inputs. So nitrous input 1, the way that this is typically used, I'm not saying always, but you just need to understand how it works. Nitrous input 1 is typically set to disable the stage. And what I often will do is in my pin map, I will come in here and nitrous input 1 that disables the stage will also go with the rev limiter. That's really important because you never want to spray with the rev limiter. And additionally, you do need to use one of your inputs to arm the system, and it just simply, you have to put this on one of the inputs, and whenever that input sees ground, then the nitrous is told, yes, you're allowed to spray if all other conditions are met. So with input 1 set to disable the stage at the same time that the rev limiter is activated, we'll never end up with a nitrous backfire due to hitting the rev limiter while we're spraying. Really important to use that appropriately, and it can be done the opposite way as well. Like if you need to enable the stage based on the lack of something, that can also be done by flipping the switch right here. Just understand how that works. This is not the same thing as an arm switch. An arm switch is the enable, and the input is basically an extra I/O that helps you run the nitrous. You don't even have to use it if you aren't using a two-step, and you don't want to use this at all. Just uncheck it. It's that simple. So, activation, deactivation. 85% on the TPS trigger is pretty good. You can go up to as much as 90 or something like that. What I would caution you of is don't go so close to 100 that if you are kind of fluctuate a little bit on the pedal, a couple percent, that in reality you didn't mean to do, and also in reality did not affect the performance of the engine. You don't want your nitrous coming on and off based on this TPS activation. I usually set it 85–90%, somewhere in there, and that's fine. Minimum RPM is actually a really good one because we don't want to spray too low. You got to remember that horsepower equals torque times RPM divided by 5252. So in order to make 200 more horsepower at 3000 RPM, you got to make a ton of torque, and torque is made by cylinder pressure, which means that if you hit the nitrous too early, you're way more likely to actually break parts than if you were to spray at, say, 5,000 to 7,000 RPM. So typically what I set these at is something like 5,000 to 7,000 RPM. As low as 4,500 is okay if you can help it. Best thing to do is get on a dyno, figure out where your torque peak actually is, and just, if you can, set your minimum RPM a couple hundred RPM above the torque peak. The engine's always going to breathe less up there, and it's going to be a whole lot easier on parts. Stage duration. I often don't use stage duration. It simply means that from the moment that it activates, it only runs for 10 seconds. Some guys like to do this as a safety. If you know your 8th mile racing and you're like, if you run a 10-second pass, you're going to be in trouble and they don't want anything to hang up. You can use it if you want to use it for that. A lot of times, especially in roll racing or street or whatever application you're doing this with, if it's not a specific drag racing event, I just cut that off. Don't even use that. The activation delay is obvious as well. Boost cutoff is obvious as well. This is actually really cool because I want to talk about nitrous and boost here at some point as well. AFR cutoffs. Typically, I find 15 to be too lean. I often will go somewhere around like a 13.5 on a lean cutoff because you do have this delay. You're not worried about spikes. The cutoff delay means that it has to be that lean for that long before it's actually going to shut it off. I'll go 13.5, 13.8, something like that. If we're not holding fuel any better than that, we need to abort the pass. We don't need to be running 13.8, 14.0, spraying a couple hundred horsepower worth of nitrous. So we'll set that at 13.5. The rich cutoff, guys, it's just as dangerous in some cases to be rich. A lot of times I'll set this to something like 11.0, where I'm targeting a 12 to 12.5 typically on the nitrous. I try to split that right in the middle, so we're going to go with an 11.0 right here. Cutoff delay, 1 second's fine, half a second's fine. It's up to you. Not a huge deal. Pedal control, it simply means that if you come off the throttle and go back onto the throttle, pedaling, you've lost traction. Then if you have none, then the whole thing just starts over. And it goes through, if you have anything that's time-based, whether it's this stage duration, activation delay, dry fuel ramps, anything to do with your timing or your fuel, that's just going to all start back over. If you have a pause enabled, it just means that it will stop where it was and start right back where it was. If you do a programmable restart, you actually can set a time that, let's just say I have a progressive ramp set to go from 50% to 100% over 2 seconds. Well, let's say that I wanted to, if I pedal, start back at 75%. I would just set this at 1 second, right? Because halfway between 50 and 100 is 75. Halfway between 0 and 2 seconds is going to be 1 second. So I'll just set that to 1 second, and it's going to pick up where I left off, or pick up in a programmed spot, whether I'm 5 seconds into the run or if I'm half a second into the run. It's going to start at that place. In the case of, you're not drag racing, typically a full timer reset is what you would use. Timing retard. This is the important one. You got to get your timing right. You got to run the right spark plug. You got to run the right heat range on your spark plug. If you enable fixed timing, it's going to run that number, no matter what. Not typically what you would want to do for a progressive, right? Because let's say we got, a ramp going up. You don't want to have your full timing pulled out during the ramp. It's just going to be lazy for no reason. So typically I never run fixed timing. You can if it works for you, but that's not something I usually do. In the case of a stick car, this should become RPM. I much prefer RPM here. In the case of an automatic, especially an automatic that's doing drag racing, this can become time, because sometimes time is the thing that you're really playing the game of. You can really fudge your 60-foot stuff right here. So long story short, my car is a stick car. We're going to go with RPM on this particular case. We're not going to spray like low at all. We're not going to spray below 4,500, right? So really where I'm going to come in here is, it's on the underside, I understand that, but let's just go 4,000 to, and we're going to go over as well, so we'll go 4,000 to 8,000. This just helps me set the shape of the curve. I'm going to highlight the entire thing. We'll do a fill row values. That gets us, even spacing. What's more important here is that we know what we're doing with the progressive. So I'm going to stop right here. We've got no timing retard right now. This hold after deactivation is just a way to get all the nitrous that's in the engine out. It's good to have some amount of time in here. When you deactivate, that means you're coming out of the throttle, so you don't really care what the timing is when you're coming out of the throttle after a nitrous pull. So I'm going to scroll down just a little bit here, and let's talk about what we're going to do for a progressive. In the case of a drag car that is doing some 60-foot work and some 330 work, and maybe 1/8 mile drag racing, 1/4 mile, whatever, time-based works, because we're doing things in order to minimize time, and so we can make very small adjustments based on time, rather than trying to find the exact RPM on a launch that we want something to happen. So time-based is really good for that. In the case of what I'm doing, stick car that's not always drag raced, I'm going to treat this thing as kind of like extra NA power. So we're going to come in here. It's going to go RPM based again. I'm going to use the same. This is not required, okay, but this is something I like to do. I like to have the same values in my timing retard as what's in my progressive control, and the reason for that is because I can line these up. I can look and see exactly where everything's going to line up at, and what percent duty cycle on the solenoid I'm going to get, and what I'm going to get up here on the timing retard. So we're not even going to spray at 4,500. So the question is, what do I want my duty cycle to be when it comes in? I'm going to come in here, and let's say we're going to go to like 40%. I want it to be fairly soft coming in. In the case of this car, I guess I've pretty much at this point given away. I'm going to try to put some nitrous on the vet here. In the case of this car, I've got something like, I want to say it's either 175 or a 200 horsepower solenoid, which means that 40% of that is going to be just under 100 horsepower. That's a nice, soft little hit to get started. But chips at 7,400 and, peak power is at 65, so like right in here, 61 to 69, I'm going to say let's do something like 75%. We'll try for about 150. And I'm going to do a ramp right here and say, you know what? I don't know if I really like the shape of that. So I can come in here and we can just fudge this a little bit. We can make this more of a curve than a linear ramp. And then if you want to, make it really smooth, we'll come in here, highlight these, smooth selected. It's got a nice shape to it, okay? And as I head up towards my my rev limiter, I think I already set the maximum RPM to 7,000. Let's go ahead and move that real quick. So I'm actually going to move this. The rev limiter is at 7,400. I'm going to go ahead and move this to 7,200. It's nice and close to the limiter. But what I really want to do here, so I've got a 7,200 cell, I want to go ahead and start pulling a little bit out when I'm way up there. Just to start the, what I want to do is I want to feel it in the seat of my pants and go, okay, all right, get ready to shift. It's time to shift. In the 7,400 cell, I'm not going to I'm going to go ahead and just put 74 even right there. And, I want to make sure we're 0 by 7,400. We're never going to get there anyway because it's going to shut off at by 72. But you know what? Let's be thorough. Let's make sure that all this stuff lines up. All right. So now we know, all right, I think in this region, I'm going to have about 75 horsepower. And by the time I get here, I'm going to have about 150 horsepower. My rule to start off with is 2 per 50. I think everybody uses a rule that's somewhere around 2 per 50. So I'm going to come in here, and in these cells, I'm going to go ahead and grab the 7,200 as well, because like I said, we're trying to pull power out. So 2 per 50, I'm going to pull 6 degrees here. Now, this is the tricky part that I will admit I'm not really fond of this, but this is our timing retard, which means that a positive value pulls timing out. That means that if I put a 6 in here, if I have 26 degrees of total timing, I'm going to end up with 20. Now, if I come down here, 2 per 50, and I'm thinking I'm going to have about 75 horsepower, so we're going to have 3 degrees pulled there. And for the sake of time, we're just going to do a linear ramp, fill row values, 3 to 6. There you go. Closed loop settings, always run closed loop new target, air fuel ratio. You have Mama Holley on board. She's running the show. Use it. Why not? I got no problem using it. Target air fuel ratio, I always start with about a 12.0, depending on the power level. In this case, I probably could go a little bit less. I think I'm going to go ahead and do like a 12.4. But I always typically start with a 12.0 on the 2-ish range, 250. Just a good place. It's nice and safe, and good round number, easy to pick out if you got a problem. And it should be fat. It should be nice and safe. So always good to make sure that you are driving to a safer fuel ratio. It's not too fat, not too lean. All right, here's the fun part. This is where we actually have to tune the fueling that is done by the injectors. This is what makes it a dry shot. If I were to flip this to wet, this table right here would simply go away. What's really cool about this is it goes, all right, well, I know that you got, a solenoid duty cycle that I'm pulsing, so how much nitrous is coming through the solenoid whenever the duty cycle is 40% or 60% or 80%? Now, guys, it's really, really important. Same thing I was talking about earlier. If let's say I've got 100 jets in here. I've got 100 size nitrous jets in it, which means that I'm basically capped at 50% of my 200 horsepower solenoid. If you come in here and you match the fuel to match your duty cycle of the solenoid, you're going to end up with a really rich condition if you have 100 jets in here, if you have smaller jets in here. So what my recommendation is to you is first do your math, figure out, what's your cap for your nitrous added. So in my case, I'm going to run 150 horsepower jets. So I don't want to run any more than 150 horsepower. And what I always do is 50 pounds per hour for every 100 of nitrous, of fuel added. And guys, don't get me wrong, somebody's going to go, holy crap, that's fat. Yes, it is fat. It's a lot of fuel. Closed loop's going to help me. I'm going to run a pass or two, look at my data logs, and this is what's really important about having a well-tuned NA, is because you're going to look at fuel flow. And you're going to set, because this is what we're talking about here, is fuel flow. So you look at your fuel flow, you know what your fuel flow in your base table is supposed to be, and you know what your actual fuel flow is. And so you can take your closed loop comp at that point, because you're assuming your comp would be 0 if you were NA, and come in here and just make the added fuel flow. You can multiply it by your comp, or you can say, all right, my fuel flow minus my base is the actual fuel flow in this particular spot, and just type that number right in, right here. 50 is going to be a little bit fat, but like I said, we're going to pull fuel, not have to add it. We want to be reactionary in the right direction. So in the cells that are 75, we're assuming that at 75%, we're going to be at 150 horsepower worth of fuel. And so that means that, ironically, I really did not plan this, we're going to be at 75 pounds per hour added, because I basically always do half of what I'm adding for the horsepower. So we're going to add 75 there. And at the 40 region, we're going to make the assumption that we are at, let's call it 80 horsepower. So we're going to be, again, a little bit ironic. This does not apply to everything. It just happens to be working out because I chose 150 horsepower jets. We're going to come in here, we're going to put 40 pounds per hour, which is half of the 80. And to be honest with you guys, I do this. I do fill row values, and then I'll do the exact same thing. You should end up with something that looks kind of like this. At that point, I'm just going to come in here, make sure that all that looks right, and I should be able to draw a line straight through that 40. We ended up 41. But this is a rough linear curve of the duty cycle that's going to be of that solenoid. Now, guys, don't command less than 20. Okay? You're not going to get repeatable actuation of the solenoid, and you're going to struggle with it. It's not going to work. Same thing for once you cross that 80 to 85% duty cycle, you might as well consider the thing is just totally and completely all the way on. In this case, I'm not going to do a full ramp, remember, because I said I have 150 horsepower jets in this thing, which means we're going to be stopping at the 150 range. One last little tidbit, I kind of glanced over this. The frequency, you need to look up what frequency your nitrous manufacturer wants you to run the solenoids at. Typically it's 15 to 20 hertz. I just pick a number. Good to dry test and make sure that the solenoid is clearly pulsing well and not misfiring on the pulses or anything like that. All right, so that is a not very brief overview on how to set up dry nitrous. The cool part is, if you're going to set up wet nitrous, it's actually really simple. You just come in here, you're going to say wet, we're going to leave it progressive, why not? Everything else is the same. Everything else is the same. The only difference is no fuel table. We just took the fuel table clean off of it, because you're telling Holley that you're going to add fuel with a nitrous fuel solenoid and jets. Now, what I will tell you guys is that, in my experience, fuel flowing through a solenoid at somewhere between 12 and 70 psi, depending on what you have and what your jets are, does not behave in the same way that nitrous flowing through a solenoid that is designed for nitrous flows. And it definitely does not do that at progressive frequencies. So frequency is the wrong word, at progressive pulse widths. So when you're commanding a fuel solenoid to pulse at 50% duty cycle, that means it's half on and half off. The fuel flow through that thing is fairly erratic. It's difficult to start and stop flow of a fluid like gasoline or E85 or fuel. Much more difficult to start and stop flow at 12 or 6 psi than it is at 70. But remember, guys, we've got nitrous that is basically in gas form by the time it's coming out of this bottle, that is at like 950 psi. So it moves and changes very quickly. I don't like running progressive wet. If you're going to run a wet kit, I highly recommend that you just run that thing like this, wet non-progressive, and it's simply going to basically do all your triggering and a timing retard. That's it. And it's going to say whenever I am triggering the solenoid to be always on, I'm going to do a timing retard. In this case, enable fixed timing actually works pretty darn good, right? Because we're going to spray the same amount of nitrous the whole time. Might as well just go ahead and pull the timing, and whether you're at low RPM or high RPM, it doesn't matter. It's going to be roughly the same amount of timing getting pulled, and easy peasy. It's all right there. All right, as far as mapping goes, I think we already kind of touched on that just a little bit. There's going to be 3 things that you need to do typically. The first thing is you got your enable. So you need to assign your enable to an input. That's a toggle switch that says, yes, I want to spray when this is enabled. Your input 1 is going to be put on your rev limiter, your 2-step or something like that. And then your output. You're going to have a pulse width minus output that you need to set up. And that simply put is what's going to run. In the case of a progressive setup, you need to run a solid state relay. In the case of a non-progressive, if it's just a always on, then you could in theory run a standard clip type relay. I don't really recommend that, but just simply because, man, it would suck if that thing hung up and got stuck on or something just silly. There's a mechanical device in there that on an off chance current was high, potentially could arc in there and like basically weld itself on, and gosh, that would suck. The recommendation for me, I always just run a solid state relay. The NOS or the Holley relay is perfectly fine for that, no problem at all. Same one you'd run with like a trans brake or something. All right, that's pretty much the setup for nitrous. And one last thing I just want to touch on. We talked about the boost cutoff and how we could actually do. I can't actually enable the boost cutoff right now because I don't have the boost ICF loaded up here. We can throw that in real quick, and I mean, there's not really anything that is too exciting. Oh gosh, this is just going to turn me into a nightmare. So I don't have the right map sensor. Let's call it, sure, well, it can be a 2-bar, why not? Okay, so we got turbo icon in here. We got the boost ICF. Boost cutoff now allows me to say, all right, at a certain boost pressure, I want to stop spraying. Why is this important? Because nitrous is the most epic turbo spooler known to man. Nitrous is awesome. It is instant exhaust pressure. It is great for spooling turbos. And a lot of guys will spray, a 50 shot, which ends up making twice that, to 5 psi, just to light the turbo. As soon as you see 5 psi, turn the nitrous off. We're done with that. We're making boost. That said, it's really important you guys also know that nitrous actually helps combustion in the case when you're running boost, because what happens with boost is you end up with this hot charge that is extremely dense, and it's very difficult to light it because the relative oxygen content is fairly low. So all the problems that come with boost are actually helped by nitrous. And I'm not going out and telling you that you need to run a 300 shot on top of 25 pounds of boost. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that if you're running, 10, 12 pounds of boost and you want to run like 15 pounds of boost with the proper fuel, I'm not telling you to go blow your engine up. But what I am saying is that you can get away with roughly the same timing, because what it actually does is it speeds up combustion. As you increase the oxygen content in the chamber, combustion occurs faster, which means that you don't have to reduce your timing value in order to make sure that you don't get into a knock situation when your cylinder pressure is too high. So consider it for a turbo spooler. Consider it for a little bump. A lot of times whenever guys do this, you'll see that you spray a 50 shot and you make 90 more horsepower or something silly. I do have one guy, and he'll know who he is if he watches this video, that completely is just overrunning the wastegate whenever he sprays on top of his 15 pounds of boost, and the thing just flies to 20 pounds of boost, and it's on pump gas, and it makes me like cringe, and I'm just waiting for the day that he sends me a picture of the rods sitting on the ground. But so far so good. It's like if you made 20 pounds of boost alone, or if you sprayed it that hard alone, it probably wouldn't work, but the combination together is like magic. So use that information cautiously. I did not tell you to go spray your engine that's making 20 pounds of boost with a 300 shot. I am not responsible for your ringlands or your wrist pins. Now that the disclaimer's over, again, like, subscribe, ring the bell, comment, go to the GSP Facebook page, all the good stuff. Thanks for sitting through this one. It went a little longer than I expected, but I hope that it's full of good information, and I will catch you guys on the next one.